Hello and welcome back to Scale War Machines and the second part in this series looking at the Dark World Creations Judge Dredd figure on his Lawmaster. This is a guide all about painting a comic book hero, and last time I assembled the model and primed it. I also blocked out all the base colours and applied those by airbrush. That included the motorcycle but also the figure. I then applied some modulation to his ride, before moving on fairly swiftly to blocking out the colours on our hero's uniform. Towards the end of the last video, I managed to get a bit of colour on the helmet, and that's where we'll pick up in part 2. Taking the motorcycle, I wanted to unify the modulation and apply a filter over the base colours. I use this reference from Wilder, and the purpose of a filter is just to smooth out all the contrasts and add a bit more chroma or luminance to the base colours. In this case it's supposed to be a vibrant blue which is applied to Panzer Grey, but I found it went really well over the blue shades that I'd used on the base coats of the motorcycle. You should see a more even graduation between the blue shades. Time now to move towards the figure, and I resumed with all his uniform and paraphernalia, pouches, pads and so on, and that was with the greens, and the references are here. These are the same colours I used in part 1, and I tackled these items repeatedly during the course of this paint job. I then moved on to all his shoulder pads and crest on the right hand shoulder, and for that I used a Game Colour Opaque reference. Even though these are opaque paints, I still found I needed a couple of coats. As you can see, I'm just applying it with a fine brush and letting it dry. It's really interesting because it dries a lot less yellow than it goes on, and it's a really useful shade. I applied a further coat just to get plenty of depth in the colours. The same shade was used of course on the motorcycle, and I applied it in a similar fashion. Next it was time to pick out all the piping around the base of the motorcycle, and for that I used Vallejo's Red. You can see the reference on screen, and just using a fine Kolinsky sable brush I was able to pick those out really easily. Here's how the model looks at this stage. It's all very clean, but all the main colours are picked out and ready for later weathering stages. I moved on to Life Colour now and their leather set, and that was used to paint the bench seat on the motorcycle. You'll see I'll come back to this a few times during this video. This was the base shade, and as you'll see these Life Colour paints are really opaque and do go on really well with one coat. With that done, it's time to pick out some more features on the motorcycle, first with a brush and then an airbrush. A bit like last time, you'll see that these standard bottle paints are airbrushable. I needed to use them in the intended fashion by brush first, but then... yes, just remember that these Vallejo paints are never going to come unblocked through pressure alone. So watch out, if you have a blockage, unblock it with a pin. Anyway, despite that little explosion, you'll see that initially I brush painted on a mix of these two references. This was to paint all the pipework, exhaust pipes, engine and so on, and they went on well in this case. I noticed there was a slight problem with the handlebar. There was some debris or a defect. I picked away at that with a scalpel, made sure it looked better. The TV screen needed a coat of grey as well, and that yielded something like this. Before I could airbrush though, I spotted some highlighting was needed on the checkered pattern of the headlights. I wanted to just pick out the squares and make sure that they popped a bit more. I mixed up a lighter version of the base coats that you saw in part 1 and made sure that the top checkers were picked out with the lighter colour. I could then paint his personal weapon in the same grey colour before moving on to sealing parts of the figure, and particularly the helmet, where I wanted to get a very high gloss finish. For that I used Johnson's Clear, which is an acrylic floor polish that you'll know well. I applied multiple coats and that gave a really nice shiny effect. I also applied it to the headlights and other glass areas. That would ensure that there was a little bit of brilliance, a little bit of shine on those components. It made sense to also paint the red areas, the bumper areas if you like, the bump strips along the base of the motorcycle. Time now to focus on the face. In order to paint the face, I used a tried and tested method and some paints that I'm really fond of, the Vallejo face painting set. There's not actually much of the character's face that's visible on this moulding, so it was really quite quick to paint, and it was a simple case of following the instructions in the set. At this stage I also buffed the helmet a bit more, using some Tamiya compound, before creating a glossy red. This was done using the previous red reference and a bit of Vallejo's gloss varnish. This was all done whilst the base paint for the face was actually drying. You can see me there just picking out the main features of the helmet. Whilst that was setting up, I moved on to the motorcycle and applied a bit of this Game Colour ink sepia wash. Or I guess it's actually an ink rather than a wash, but it behaves very much like a wash. That was applied all around the eagle crest on the motorcycle and anywhere where there would be shadow, including on the figurine itself, especially on all the previously painted components in that gold colour. I quite like this product, it's the first time I've used it, but it did well to apply a convincing brownish shadow to those parts of the figurine. You can see the overall effect. Now I needed to resume with some highlights on the figure, and I used a very simple wet palette method. It's just a piece of foam with some paper towel applied and water applied over the whole of that, and that just allows the paints to remain moist and workable. This time I was going for scratches and real punchy highlights over the green areas. This would of course be especially strong on things like the knee pads. They would see a lot of wear. So I worked my way around the model and applied these scratches and highlights to anywhere that I felt was pertinent or relevant. I wanted to get a really sort of leathery, scratched look on these parts of the figurine. You can see me pick out individual pouches with a much lighter mix. This helps them to pop and creates a pleasing contrast all over the figurine. I went a shade lighter by adding more white and picked out the ammo pouches all around the belt. This started to create the shadow and highlight that's so popular on figures and really makes all the components stand out and gives the figure a real impression of relief and 3D-ness. I was trying to capture a specific comic book look when painting this figurine. I felt the stark highlights helped with that. I was pleased with how it was evolving, but I did continue to work all the green parts until I was really satisfied. That allowed me to then move on to the Vallejo face painting set and the next stage in that colour system. It really is a case of just following the instructions. The paint set that I've featured in other videos includes a very helpful guide, but as you can imagine it's a case of working through progressively lighter shades. Here you can see me apply the final highlight shade. Then I went back over it with a mix of these two shadow colours. Those are particularly useful just to define those shadow areas and make sure that it's not too highlighty. This is how the face looks at this stage. As I mentioned, I wanted to capture this kind of comic book look, and I think it was coming out pretty much as I wanted. The armour needed a bit more highlight to it though, of course, picking up where I'd left that sepia shadow previously. That was a simple case of mixing up a lightened version of the base colour and applying it quite dry around the highlights on the shoulder armour. I also used that shade to apply some scratches to the helmet to give it a really worn look. The final stage was to use the dry brushing technique. If you're not familiar with dry brushing, I have done a video on it. Again with the same shade, and just very lightly, very gingerly, dry brush over the top highlights and the biggest relief, rubbing the brush very carefully over the prominent features of the moulding to leave a subtle highlight. The key with this technique is of course not to put too much paint on the brush, and that's why it's called dry brushing. I returned to the sepia ink and just defined a bit more the shadows on parts of the armour, leaving the figure and motorcycle in this kind of state. This is pretty much there in terms of all the base colours. Parts of the model have been picked out in detail, and it was time to return to the bench seat and the Life Colour leather set. You'll see me work on this part of the model quite a bit, mainly because I was trying out this new reference for the first time, and it's a good way of painting leather. There you can see me apply all the mid scratches. Before moving on to the airbrushing stage with this model, to do that I masked off all the parts that I was going to spray with Tamiya masking tape, and then went back to my grey shades from the previous part of the video, mixed them up, thinned them, and sprayed them very carefully through my airbrush. The idea was to create variety and graduations all over the metal components of the model. The only difference was I'd added more white. Again, this is perhaps unusual, but I was going for the muted matte comic book look rather than going for metallic colours. And I felt the light greys with scratches and white and highlights all over them was a good way to achieve this. As with most armour modelling or weathering techniques, plenty of chipping was applied with the lightened coats. This was all over the engine block and the handlebars and parts of the model that would see a lot of wear. I removed the masking, and that created highlights and subtle blending of colour over the engine block that I was happy with. I wasn't as happy with the seat, so I toned that down with the dark leather reference. I picked out some components in black before returning to the wilder filter I'd used in the early part of this video. This was again applied all over the model, particularly the blue parts, but anywhere where I felt I wanted just to blend and unify the colours, and perhaps tone down some of those brighter base shades. Time for washes now, and I used the wilder range to create a dark wash. This was applied all over parts of the model to create shadows, and this is like any wash, you want it to land in all the recesses and areas of natural shadow. Excess can be removed with a cotton bud or Q-tip moistened with a little bit of thinners. I also applied some dirty mud washes. You can see the reference on screen. This is again from the Wilder set. A dark shadow wash was applied. I wanted to add lots of mud and splatter all over the bottom of the Lawmaster. This was done by turning my airbrush right down, using the Mk valve on the body of the airbrush, and taking the two muddiest Wilder references, both from their splatter range, and applying those at low pressure to get the stippling I wanted over the base. With that I could apply a dust coat to the resin cast base piece for the actual model itself, the display piece, and here you can see how the model looks. I did paint this quite a while ago, but I'm still quite happy that I tried something different, that I went for a comic book style for my paint job. Of course there's lots of areas that could be improved as always, but overall I was pleased that I got an eye-catching result. Something that was bright and colourful, definitely different from my usual fare, all those military subjects and muted military colours. Anyway, thanks for watching, I'll see you next time on Scale War Machines, thanks for all the support, and if you wouldn't mind subscribing, that would be great. Goodbye.
Subscribe for our latest videos.